So about 3 months ago at time of writing, I made my video Let's Talk About Non-Binary Character Design, in which I went over the basics of what makes for good and bad representation from both the appearance and characterization standpoints of non-binary characters. And in that video, I mentioned in passing that a lot of video games that possess non-binary options still tend to come at it from a very binary mindset, and I also said that topic was best discussed in its own video. Well, today is that day and this is that video, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately and also because it won my Patreon vote in a landslide. See, as much as whinging little shits in the business of peddling outrage might try to deny it, non-binary people exist. We have always existed, and we will continue to exist both in real life and within the media people consume, especially going forward. More and more games include both non-binary characters and non-binary character options for the player, and it's the latter subject I'd like to talk about today. Because while last time I talked about the importance of characterization and the issue of androgyny and the difference between good enough and great, today I'd like to talk about the design ethos of non-binary character building options, as well as the importance of the story and gameplay integration of those options. And I'll also outline the difference between good enough and great for these as well. I promise this will be more interesting than I probably just made it sound. Before I begin though, I'd like to set a few things straight. First of all, I will specifically be talking about games that allow you to build your character to some degree and allow you the option of identifying as non-binary. I'll also be splitting the video into two main segments, the first discussing the character builders themselves and their non-binary identity options, and the second discussing the ways that these elements are integrated into the story and gameplay itself, which I feel is incredibly important as we move towards better and more common non-binary representation. Secondly, a few people seemed confused as to what I meant by good enough last time, so let me set the record straight. Good enough means that you have done the bare minimum expected. It means fine, a C, a passing grade. Good enough is the baseline you should be starting from, and you should not expect praise for including it. For context, good enough for a character builder's non-binary options is allowing the player to identify as non-binary at all and use they/them pronouns. And good enough for integration is using those pronouns in the game itself. It is 2025, we need to stop pretending that developers deserve accolades and blowjobs for merely acknowledging we exist, because I'm really very tired of seeing lists of the games with the best non-binary representation, and having most of the examples be games that just allow you to play as an NB and be referred to by your chosen pronouns. Step up your game, you can do better. Third, I want to make the definition of androgyny clear to people, because there was no shortage of comments with people saying something along the lines of, well, I don't think X character is androgynous, they're too masculine or feminine. Androgynous does not mean it is impossible to tell someone's sex at a glance, and it does not mean having a perfectly balanced mix of masculine and feminine traits. Androgynous is simply the term for someone who possesses a mix of both traditionally masculine and feminine aspects in their appearance. There are different degrees of androgyny, but this is the base meaning of the word, and it is what I'm using when I say it. Are we clear? Finally, my comment section is not the place to debate whether or not you think non-binary people exist, or to spew any level of transphobia. If I see that garbage, you will be blocked and reported. I'm afraid I've rather run out of patience for douchebags right now. Oh, and all of the music and game footage will be listed in the credits at the end, as they always are. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? Let's talk about non-binary character building options. Part 1. Character builders and the binary mindset. Now, you may be surprised to learn this, but video games are enjoyed by many people of varying genders. Shocking, I know, and it's because of this that certain games, beginning with CRPGs before becoming a fairly common staple of the RPG genre in general, began to integrate character builders into their designs. And the purpose of this isn't just for fun, it's to increase immersion and help players relate to the world of the story better via an avatar of themselves. And obviously they didn't start out with non-binary options, the word as a term for gender identity is relatively new, with the first recorded instance I could find in my research being used in 1995 and still not getting traction in the popular lexicon until 2013. But the ability to choose your gender has been a part of gaming for quite some time now. Sadly, I couldn't find the first game to allow the player to choose their character's gender, but I did find one of the first games to allow you to choose a third option. And it came out way before you'd expect. It was actually the game Ultima 3 back in 1983, where you were given the options of male, female, or other. Due to memory and programming limitations, these options didn't have any impact on gameplay, nor did they change your pronouns, but the option was still there, and it was even in the game's manual, because this was back in the dark ages where game manuals were still a thing. In the interest of fairness and accuracy, I should note that this may specifically be referring to intersex people instead of NBs, as sex and gender, even now, tend to get conflated, and the two were basically interchangeable back then. But this does technically still count as the game giving you an option outside of male or female, which is really cool. Sadly, I don't believe the series has ever given a third gender option again, but again, it's still cool. I personally consider it more of an honourable mention than true representation for the purpose of this list, but I'd honestly like to hear what you guys think as well. So aside from Ultima 3, which I literally only learned about whilst in the middle of writing the script for this video, two of the earliest examples I could find came in the form of Fallen London and Choice of the Dragon, two text-based adventure games that you can play for free, and both of which I honestly recommend, they're very fun. Of the two, you're most likely to have heard of Fallen London. I believe it's a full series now, and several other YouTubers have already brought it up for how it handles its representation. And I am personally specifically referring to the first game in the Fallen London universe, as it's the only one I've played. The game takes place in an alternate universe where a massive hellmouth has opened up right next to London, rather than the reality of Brexit turning Britain into another circle of hell on earth. Upon starting up the game, it asks you for your gender, and your options are lady, gentleman, or my dear sir, there are individuals roaming the streets of Fallen London at this very moment with the faces of squid. Squid! You ask them their gender, and yet you waste our time asking me trifling and impertinent questions about mine. It is my own business, sir, and I bid you good day. This is delightful, and I know it might come across as kind of a how dare you assume my gender type joke, but the integration actually makes it work. The universe of Fallen London is very cheeky and facetious, and so it fits that you would talk about your gender in a very cheeky and facetious way. And in a world where squid people and demons roam the streets, I mean yeah, who the hell cares what my gender is? Good day, sir. Also, this game came out in 2009, so I'm fairly certain it's sufficiently removed from the time of how dare you assume my gender to be taken in good faith. Probably. I'm not sure. The passage of time has lost all meaning. Choice of the Dragon is a considerably shorter experience in which you get to build and roleplay as a dragon, which is very fun, and it's also free, so you should check it out right now. It actually came out in 2010, a year after Fallen London. Upon reaching the gender options of the character builder, it gives you the options of male, female, neither, unknown/undetermined, or do not pester me with impertinent questions. The narrator actually begs for forgiveness and asks if they should refer to your gender at all, which I have to say definitely makes me feel very draconic. Your gender doesn't play much of a role in the story, nor does it affect your chances with one of the potential mates of the game. I wanted to bring these up because not only are they enjoyable games, but they also demonstrate just how much times have changed. 15 years ago, a game referring to you via gender-neutral pronouns was revolutionary. In 2025 though, this is just good enough now. As we continue to talk about games with proper character building options, I think it's important to note that my standards for good character builders is going to be a little different from my standards for good non-binary representation. If you've seen my video on non-binary character design, then you'll probably remember that I said the best representation doesn't solely rely on androgyny in design, and a single non-binary character to act as a representative for the whole of the group. And while I stand by those for the purpose of integration, which I promise I'll expand on when we get to that segment, my feelings towards character builders are different because non-binary options in the character building section of the game should be made with both the freedom and comfort of the player in mind. Let me be clear, a game does not need to hand absolute customizability to the player to be considered good. However, a lot of games, despite having non-binary options, are still built upon the gender binary and struggle to break away from that mindset. YouTuber VerilyBitchie dubbed this the sexy binary and pointed out that a lot of games that are supposedly very trans-inclusive are still very restrictive in what they allow you to do. I'll link to their video on the sexy binary down below because it's very interesting, and I'll be borrowing her terms for the remainder of the video because I do agree that it's a bit of a problem with many developers' design ethos in that, despite their desire to be more inclusive, they're still hampered by a binary mindset. And to demonstrate what I mean, let's start with Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 got a lot of attention for its trans-inclusive options, and at first glance, it's good. You're given the option of identifying as male, female, or non-binary/other, and your gender identity does not restrict your body, voice, or genital options. You can have both honkers and a hot dog if you like, and you're not punished for it in the slightest. However, customization kind of stops here. While body types aren't labelled as male or female, they're very clearly still designed with a very strict mindset, where, for example, the masculine bodies are always taller than the feminine bodies, and being curvy means having to have breasts. So if I, say, want to recreate Lucius as a cleric in 5e because he's extremely gender and one of my favourite characters, and also I want to feel pretty, then I just get to eat shit. No femboy build for you, my friend. I love Baldur's Gate 3 and I've had a lot of fun with it, but I really wish I could have had the freedom to make my body look the way I actually want to, instead of having to finagle a general approximation of it out of the bodies of the most inoffensively attractive extras Hollywood had on hand. The game also has dogshit integration, but we'll get back to that later. Avowed is similar to Baldur's Gate 3 in what it allows you to do, except it doesn't let you choose your genitals because there's no sex in the game, and therefore no real point in giving you the option in the first place. From a utilitarian design standpoint at least. You choose between two body types, choose your pronouns and choose your voice, but it pretty much stops there. What's actually kind of funny is that when I was thinking about buying the game, it was two things that really clinched it for me. The first was the creator beefing with a bunch of losers on Twitter who were whining about there being non-binary options, because there is always someone whining about that. And the second was that the IGN review said there were too many bears in the game, and that sounded like something I had to see. Given how heated the conversation around the game seemed to be, I thought there must be something special in here, but no, it's just another sexy binary, which is, again, it's good enough, it's fine. The game's alright though, fun combat and plenty of bears to go around. See, the problem with games like these two is that, even though they give the option of playing a non-binary character, they're still very tied to traditional interpretations of gender, and it kind of reinforces gender stereotypes, as things like height and body shape are locked to one body type. And even in games where they allow you to do things like adjust your height, the maximum height of the feminine body is still shorter than that for the masculine one. And to those of you typing in the comments to remind people that women are, on average, shorter than men, yeah, on average. But exceptions exist, and players should be allowed to stray from gender conformity if they want to. Part of this, I think, comes down to the fact that these games are very focused on graphics. The AAA industry is obsessed with the idea of bigger and more, and the budget always has to be on screen, which means more and more details added to the character models, and this mindset seems to mean that they have to look like supermodels, and supermodels have to look as gendered as possible. There's just no other acceptable outcome. So how do we fix this? Well, some might suggest scaling back on the details and allowing room for more interpretation. This is the design ethos that Verity referred to as mixed blobby, which I'll be doing too because I'm lazy and it's already a good term. Boyfriend Dungeon is one of the games that goes this route, and yes, I am aware that I've talked about this game in every LGBT rep video I've ever made, and I will continue to do so until my demands are met. Anyway, at least in part due to it being an indie game with a budget smaller than the GDP of an island nation, Boyfriend Dungeon takes a more minimalist approach to character design. You can choose your gender and even your appearance to an extent, but the design remains androgynous and somewhat vague. Instead, you express your gender through the clothes you wear and the pronouns you choose, and your body is largely incidental, which is an interesting way of looking at it. I enjoy this aspect of the game, I think it's cute and charming, but some people may feel it's more lacking than not, and I wouldn't blame them for feeling this way. Boyfriend Dungeon definitely shines more through its integration than its character builder, but again, I'll have to come back to that later. There are a good number of games that handle character builders via this minimalist design ethos, but this approach isn't for everyone, and it's definitely not perfect by any means. So if the sexy binary is too restrictive and the mixed blobby approach is too far in the other direction, then surely games that fall somewhere in the middle should be best, yeah? Arcadia Fallen is a visual novel about using alchemy to steal away demons using spirit magic, and its approach to character design falls somewhere between the two extremes, once again giving you the options of identifying as male, female, or non-binary, but it also gives you the choice of 3 body types. And again, gender is not tied to body type. This is an interesting take, and not one that you tend to see very often, though it has its pros and cons. While I think it's nice that the developers thought about giving people a third option, it does run the risk of feeling somewhat limiting to people who don't feel that this is androgynous enough, or who feel that it's still somewhat limited. It's still better than just the sexy binary, but, you know, someone's gonna complain. To be clear, I do not expect indie games to all include sliders and mass customization options, and demanding something like that would be short-sighted and selfish. I'd also like to make it clear that Arcadia Fallen's character creator is not bad by any stretch of the meaning. I've seen several other games that employ similar options, and I actually think it's a good step forward. A third body type is absolutely a good first step away from the sexy binary, and a good idea to keep in mind for the future. However, there are 3 other games I'd like to highlight before we get into the integration section that I feel go above and beyond in regards to character builders, and that I think we have a lot to learn from. And those are Dragon Age the Veilguard, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, and Saints Row 2022. Yes, really. Veilguard is probably the very best of what the sexy binary has to offer. Upon starting the character builder, it gives you a smattering of different bodies to choose from, and they act as mere templates. You can choose between identifying as male, female, or non-binary, and interestingly, your pronouns and your gender identity are separate, which is really cool. You almost never see that. You can also select from a collection of voices, one of which is Erika Ishii, and therefore is the correct option no matter the build. Yes, I am biased. And while you start with presets, the game gives you the options of sliders to fine-tune your look, which means I can have a masculine body with an hourglass figure if I want, or a feminine body built like a brick shithouse if I prefer. There's even the option of a bold slider and mastectomy scars for a more authentic trans experience. This is honestly very good, and probably the best I've personally played around with. However, the game still doesn't give the option of a truly balanced build. The feminine presets still cannot be as tall as the masculine ones, nor can their bulges be as prominent, which seems weirdly arbitrary for a game that allows such body fluidity otherwise. Oh, and from what I can tell, you also cannot give breasts to a masculine preset. Though it's possible I just didn't notice that option because my ADHD decided we've spent too much time in the character creator. Either way, Veilguard does a very good job, though it's sadly still tied down by the sexy binary. I'll have a lot more to say on the game when I get to the integration section. Speaking of Veilguard, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game I almost didn't play because some dipshit kept trying to use it as a cudgel in an attempt to convince me that Veilguard had horrible representation actually. No really, please ignore the fact that I'm being incredibly transphobic in my argument and misgendering the characters. It sort of soured me on the prospect of playing it if I'm being honest. Luckily, I'd already bought it upon recommendation by a good friend, so I didn't miss out on this absolute gem of a game. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a visual novel deck-building hybrid about you, a young exocolonist, starting your life on a new world, and it actually falls somewhere on the midpoint between mixed blobby and sexy binary. You start out as a 6-year-old and choose both your pronouns and your physicality, both of which can be freely changed throughout the game. However, your appearance doesn't actually get altered based on your selection until you reach your late teens, and despite the fairly detailed character art, you remain honestly pretty androgynous no matter what, and it's only really your hair that will change to a noticeable degree. All that said, Teenage Exocolonist does something I absolutely adore, and that is that it allows you to fully customize your pronouns. This is something I haven't seen any other game do, and it's fucking amazing. It's not just pronouns either. You can actually change how the game refers to you in almost any capacity, from terms of endearment to title to how someone expresses the way they find you attractive. So not only can you choose to identify as they, it, or they if you want, but you can alternate between gendered and non-gendered pronouns if you wish, and you can even decide you'd rather be called a thought because the idea of someone calling me cowpoke makes me want to retch. This is the most freedom I've ever seen in expressing your identity through words, and I think it's absolutely beautiful that the developers not only decided they wanted to give people what is essentially the video game equivalent of a perfect social transition, but also powered through the absolutely hellish headache of programming the damn thing to function as well as it does. I didn't notice a single slip up once, and that alone is worthy of a fucking award. Absolutely, more developers should try to incorporate something like this system into their games. However, and let's be completely fair and honest here, this only works because the game isn't voiced, and it would be completely unreasonable to expect games with full voice acting to implement something like what Teenage Exocolonist has. Not just because it would be prohibitively expensive to even attempt such a thing, but because there's just no way for anyone to prepare for the absolute glut of things people will come up with. Games with voice acting can get around things like the player name by leaving it blank, or by giving the player a nickname, or just by saying you, but that tactic would never work for a system like the one Exocolonist has. So great for non-voiced games, and a phenomenal example of identity customization, but it's not something everyone can or should attempt, or should be expected to. Finally, we have Saints Row 2022, which was by all accounts a pretty mid-game at best. However, it's probably the best example of breaking away from the sexy binary that I could find. There are no body types to really choose from, just a set of sliders for every aspect of the body you can imagine, and no limitation on the wild bodily combinations you can create. Apparently the game doesn't even really do gender, it just refers to you as boss or you for the duration, which is an interesting choice. The apparent lack of pronouns aside, I think this is fantastic. Definitely a headache to program, but the absolute most inclusive character creator from a purely mechanical standpoint. This is where the game earns its solitary gold star, and I think it's a peek at what the AAA gaming industry could do in the future. I'll have some conclusions to draw about these games near the end, so for now let's move on to Part 2. Identity Integration and Representation. So, identity integration is my term for the way a game incorporates the player's gender identity into the narrative and gameplay. And while I'm sure there's probably an official term for this, I don't know it and I haven't seen other people talking about it, so we'll just use mine for the sake of this video, okay? Identity integration is, I think, an extremely important part of having non-binary character options, and it also brushes up against the traditional idea of representation more than the gender options do. At the most basic level, identity integration can be understood as the way the game interacts with and reaffirms the player's choice of gender identity. And this is why games don't deserve accolades simply for giving the player the option to identify as non-binary and then using the proper pronouns during gameplay, because that is the absolute bare minimum that should be expected. If you give people the option of a non-binary identity, and then do not incorporate it into the narrative or gameplay, then you don't have non-binary options. What you have is a cruel fucking joke at the expense of a marginalized group. And as I said, identity integration is the most akin to traditional representation, largely because one of the ways to utilize it is to have non-binary characters in the game. And while this is probably obvious, it should be noted that this does strictly apply to games that give you the option of identifying as non-binary, as there are plenty of games that have non-binary characters but don't give you the option yourself. In Stars in Time and Iconfell spring to mind, both of which are games with really good NB rep, and neither of which allow you access to the Build an NB workshop. But it's because of how it meshes so well with traditional representation that you can largely ensure good integration by following the rules of good representation, both of which can be found on the other videos I've made on the subject of NB rep. Remember, the point of representation isn't just to make marginalized groups feel seen, it's to raise awareness and normalize their existence. So if the absolute least that can be expected of you is to use the pronouns the player chooses, what can you do to move past good enough and get closer to great? Well, the easiest and most obvious way is to include non-binary characters outside of the player. Scarlet Hollow is a horror-themed visual novel brought to you by Black Tabby Games, the same people who made Slay the Princess, which I placed at 7th place on my list of the best games I've played in 2024, and Black Tabby Games really haven't lost their touch. Scarlet Hollow is the story of insert character name here, and their trip to the titular mining town of Scarlet Hollow at the behest of their cousin Tabitha, who requested they help in handling the funeral of their aunt Perlan. But all is not well in the obviously fucked up and haunted town, and things very quickly begin to take a turn for the horrifying. None of which I will be spoiling because more people need to play this game and support the creators. This is absolutely a tangent, but I honestly cannot recommend this game enough. It is so fucking good. Absolutely top-notch sound design too, so do make sure that you play with headphones on for maximum effect. Now the character builder is very basic. You choose your name, your gender, the name of your hometown, and the 2 special traits that will help carry you through the story. For the best possible time, by the way, make sure one of them is the ability to talk to animals. Seriously though, it makes everything better. Now your gender doesn't have an impact on the game outside of how other characters refer to you. But the game has exactly one other non-binary character, Avery, the waitstaff at the local diner. And while I know in my previous video I said that it's better for representation if you have more than one NB in your cast, Avery being the only one makes sense, as Scarlet Hollow is a tiny mining town, and they actually move there to work for their aunt. Avery is also one of the very rare examples of a black non-binary character, which we really need more of. I think Cryptid Crush is the only other game I've found that also has one. There aren't any conversations about their or your identity. Avery just kind of exists, which is honestly fine. It's not exactly setting the world on fire, and it's nothing we haven't seen before, but it's well done nonetheless. I'd say that Boyfriend Dungeon is a step above Scarlet Hollow as far as integration goes. As I mentioned in my non-binary character design video, the game does a really good job avoiding the androgyny issue, as well as making NBs feel very normal. Rowan, Holmes and Sawyer are very well designed and characterized, and the game actually acknowledges your gender if you identify as non-binary, as Sawyer mentions how cool it is to meet another NB. I do wish the game would explore the characters' identities more, but the lack of it isn't really a problem. The game allows you to change both your pronouns and your appearance anytime, so long as you're not in the dungeons, and the characters will use your new pronouns without question, which is actually something I think more games should do. I mean, Teenage Exocolonist does it, and it's an amazing game you should definitely play. Due to its nature as a coming-of-age story, Teenage Exocolonist is actually able to do a bit more than other games in terms of identity integration. As with Boyfriend Dungeon, you can change your pronouns and appearance on a whim, but it actually goes the extra mile in that it allows you to decide how puberty goes, as you and your childhood friends both metaphorically and literally grow and mature. I don't have footage of it because it caught me off guard and I was too busy laughing, but upon reaching age, I think it was like 13, it gives you the option of choosing to get your first period, your first erection, or, and I swear this is true, saying, nope, I'm like a doll down there, which is hilarious. The game also has 2 non-binary characters you can interact with, though sadly neither of them is in your age group at the start, which seems like a missed opportunity, though you do start the game with one of them in your colony, and that would be Seek. Seek is an unlikable ponce with all the charm of a steel wool hand job, but it's okay because they're balanced out by Nomi Nomi. See, about halfway through the game, another group joins your colony, bringing with it a bunch of problems and also 3 new peers. Vase, the human equivalent of a cold cup of coffee with some salt in it, Rex, who is the best boy in the goddamn universe, and Nomi Nomi, who is baby and I will kill any number of people for. Nomi Nomi is the only other non-binary member of your age group, and they are a delight. They're also demisexual, which I think is the first time I've ever seen a single game use the term at all. They're super excited to meet you, especially if you're also non-binary, something they state that their shipmates didn't tend to understand about them, and that they're glad that your people also have not boys, not girls too, which, okay, I know there's a whole debate on the use of the word non-binary in fiction, and I use the term debate very loosely here, but this is absolutely one of the times that the game should have just fucking said the word. People tend to argue that it breaks immersion to see it used, but not only are the characters from Earth, but they're also such a scientifically minded community that even the 10-year-olds use and understand far more complex terms. So there is literally no reason to dance around the subject except to be cute. I'm not subtracting points for this or anything, but there are times when people should just stop trying to be subtle about gender terms, and this is one of them. It doesn't fit the tone of the game, and while you can argue that it makes sense for the character to use a cute term, which is debatable, it still would have been better to just say the word. And on that subject, Nosia is a game that, okay, let's just call a spade, shall we? It's single-player anime Among Us with a splash of Danganronpa. I honestly can't say if it's strictly a good game, but it is uniquely enthralling. Nosia takes place on a ship in deep space 1,000 years in the future, wherein you, yes you, must navigate the delicate task of weeding out the members of your crew that have become Nosia, beings infected by the mysterious Nos and made into its servants, who literally make people entirely disappear from existence. Don't worry too much if you mess up though, you're stuck in a time loop until whatever the end game requirement is. I don't know, at time of writing I'm on loop 134 and I'm still figuring things out. Much like Scarlet Hollow, the character customization is incredibly slim. You pick your name, you pick your sex, which isn't correct, but I'll get back to that in a moment. You choose where to dump your starting stat points and what color you want to be associated with before being tossed into a philosophical conversation and then dumped into your seat at the debate table. What's interesting is, while your gender identity doesn't come up at all, at least not that I've seen so far, the game actually touches on the concept of being non-binary itself. Aside from you, if you go that route, there are 2 other non-binary characters in the form of Rakuyo and Setsu, and the game addresses their gender identities directly. Setsu is femme-presenting and gets in direct conflict with Xia Ming, who continually calls them babe, despite them repeatedly telling him that they're non-binary and it makes them uncomfortable, which is understandable. The thing about being non-binary is that even if a word is technically used in a gender-neutral way, NBs may still feel uncomfortable with being addressed by it, because it feels gendered to them. In contrast to Setsu, Rakuyo is a smug asshole with an ego that could blot out the sun, but that's not actually a problem because you actively learn why they are the way they are, and they're counterbalanced by the very comforting presence of Setsu, who becomes your best friend by virtue of being the only other person aware of the time loops. Rakuyo even has a conversation where they essentially say that gender is a construct and your body has nothing to do with your gender identity, which is accurate. But it also makes me question why the hell the game uses sex instead of gender in the character builder if they were knowledgeable enough to write this scene. But I digress. It's very clear that someone on the development team cared about proper representation. The funny thing is, even if you're not used to the presence of NPs in media, the game actually does a decent job of making the non-binary thing feel normal, because when compared to the guy who lost his skin in an accident and had it replaced with a metallic alien suit, the 1,000-year-old space hero who is actually clinically insane, the talking beluga whale who's in love with her researcher, the sex pest who was raised by hyper-intelligent bonobos, the guy who wants to be a cat, and whatever the fuck Yuriko's damage is, the fact that 2 of the crew members just don't identify with their gender assigned at birth feels comparatively mundane. I'm really not sure if this was intentional on the part of the game devs, but if it was, then I have to congratulate them for their mad genius. Hang on, Raiden, doesn't wanting to be a cat just make the guy a furry? Oh no, you misunderstand. Chippy wants to be a literal, actual cat, like a house cat. He's already had surgery to start his felinization process, and the cat on his shoulder is attached to his neck via tubes. Like I said, uniquely enthralling. Danganronpa wishes it was as weird as this game gets sometimes. The thing that makes these games work from an integration standpoint, and really the thing that makes adding visible non-binary characters to a game with non-binary options important, is that it paints a picture of being non-binary that's accurate to reality. We are uncommon and sometimes confusing to people, but we still exist. We're people. We're just as much a normal part of the world as anyone else. They don't make the player feel like an anomaly within the world of the game just because they use non-gendered pronouns. And this is why I said that including non-binary characters is the next step in integration, because it aids in the normalization process, and it also acts as representation proper. Of course, it is entirely possible to do this and actively detract from the effective integration, and to talk about that, we must finally turn back to Baldur's Gate 3. The thing about BG3 is that if it had just stuck with allowing the player to identify as non-binary and using their pronouns, it would have been fine. Unremarkable, but fine. But the problem is that the game does have non-binary characters in it, but they actively harm the game's identity integration. And you could be forgiven for assuming the game doesn't actually have any, because they're both hard to find and blink and you'll miss it subtle. The characters in question are Omeluum and Harlip. Omeluum uses its pronouns and Harlip uses they them. You're more likely to encounter Omeluum because it hangs out in the Underdark with the Myconids, but you'll only encounter Harlip if you decide to infiltrate the House of Hope, which most people will probably avoid doing because it's entirely optional and has bad idea written all over it in blazing neon colours. So there are a few big problems with these characters, the first of which being that if you didn't look it up on the wiki, you wouldn't know they were supposed to be non-binary at all, as Omeluum is a mind flayer, and calling it is more likely to be taken as a statement of fact rather than a declaration of gender identity, and Harlip is referred to by different pronouns every other sentence, so the only reason we know they're non-binary at all is because their character designer said so on their art station, which makes its canonicity dubious at best. The second big problem is that both of these characters are literally soulless monsters. The game repeatedly makes a point of stating that the process of ceremorphosis destroys the soul of the infected individual, and Harlip is both a devil and an incubus, which makes them a literal sexual predator who your only possible interactions with are either fight and kill them, or allow them to extort you for sex in exchange for information, as well as possibly devour your soul. Fuck, I hate this so much. At least Omeluum is pleasant to talk to. Everything about Harlip makes me want to punch someone at Larian. And yes, I know that for some NBs, the distance from humanity that non-human non-binary characters represents is the appeal, but this is not the way to do it. I'll have a video on the non-human non-binary trope coming sometime in the future, where I'll talk about how you do it better. Okay, so aside from the obvious problem of having your only non-binary rep be literal monsters, one of which attempts to sexually coerce you, what the fuck do you think this says about being non-binary? What message does it send to players that the only two beings that identify outside of the binary are fucking monstrosities? And this is made even worse if you play as a non-binary Dark Urge, who is the child of a murder god and whose entire narrative is about rejecting or embracing the monstrous instincts they inherited from their father. If I was Dirge and the only other person I met who shared my gender was a literal devil, I'd feel pretty fucking disheartened to say the least. This is the exact same problem that came up with Double Trouble in Sasha. If the only non-binary characters you have in your world are villains, unrepentant monsters, or just plain assholes, it sends a rather tacit message of what you think of that group. And this wouldn't even be a fucking problem if the devs had added even one other non-binary character to the roster, or, dare we fucking dream, make one of the companions non-binary. You could have made any one of the 9 companions non-binary, and it would have counterbalanced the mess of these two fuckers. You wouldn't even have to explore their gender identity if you didn't want to. You just need to have them there. I've said it before, you don't need to explore a character's gender identity to make them good representation. It just generally makes for better representation if you do. And for what it's worth, I don't think this was intentional. I don't think anyone at Larian was steepling their fingers in evil contemplation going, "This'll show those genderless fucks." As I've said before, I don't like to ascribe malice where stupidity is the probable cause, and the likely answer is just that the writers didn't think it through, because this is something almost nobody thinks through. If they did think about it at all, they likely came to the conclusion that it would be fine, because conventional wisdom seems to be that if you simply give the player non-binary options, then you've already cemented your position as a good trans ally and you're beyond reproach. But that's never been the case. Execution is still an integral part of any implementation, and BG3's execution of its identity integration was bad, plain and simple. The way BG3 handles non-binary rep continues to be my biggest gripe with the game, because it is absolute ass. But I'm done talking about how one of my favourite games pissed me the fuck off, because I'd like to finish this segment with a game that handled its integration and representation masterfully. You probably knew this was coming, if only by process of elimination, but it's time to talk about Veilguard. And I hate to break it to you, person who's currently typing "Veilguard is trash and BioWare ruined my childhood and shot my dog" in the comments as you stroke your hate boner to completion, but whether or not you personally liked Veilguard has absolutely no impact on the objective quality of its representation. And Veilguard does have good non-binary representation, the best that the AAA gaming industry has to offer in fact, and it also has the best integration on the whole of this list. What sets Veilguard apart from the other games on this list is that it integrates your gender identity into the dialogue options of the game. There are times, though not nearly as often as I'd hoped, that the game allows you to assert your gender identity when talking to other characters, and when it does this, it's absolutely fantastic. You don't actually start out with this feature activated, however, as you need to select the option using Varric's shaving mirror about 2 hours into the game. But this does allow the player a degree of control over how much their gender plays a part in the narrative. As I said, it doesn't come up super often, but it's still great when it does. Where this hits its peak, however, is with Tosh. Tosh's storyline revolves around determining their identity, both in terms of culture and gender, and you're able to help them realize that they are non-binary. The game allows you to relate your own experience with gender to theirs and help them to understand that they don't have to be a woman or a man if they don't feel comfortable with those identities. This is, and I say this in all seriousness, the best damn integration I've ever seen. Even if it hadn't allowed you to relate to Tosh, the fact that you're able to assert your gender identity in dialogue would already make this game's integration better than the vast majority of other games in existence. But when combined with Tosh's storyline, it just puts the game in a league all its own. I really do think this game should be considered the new gold standard of identity integration. Of course, that doesn't mean the game's representation and integration is beyond criticism. I'm not going to get into it here because I already made a video specifically talking about Veilguard's representation, so I'll link to that down below if you're curious on my thoughts about the game's representation as a whole. And if you'd like to make me really happy, you could also check out my full review of the game, shameless plug. I put a lot of work into it and I'd appreciate the views. Whether you like the game or not, and I'm sure plenty of you will let me know just how much you hated it because you're predictable and you think I care, the fact remains that Veilguard has unmatched identity integration, and I think future game devs and writers would benefit from learning from it. Alright, moving on. Part 3. Why it matters and what comes next. So, why am I even talking about this? What's the point of me making this video at all? Well, aside from the fact that I enjoy talking about these things and I get antsy if I don't create at regular intervals, it's because gaming is currently the single biggest entertainment industry in the world, and because these things matter. Media has always played an important role in changing the way people view minority groups, and proper representation can be the difference between normalization and demonization. And this holds especially true for people in the queer community. The sad truth is that the first time a lot of people will be made aware of the existence of gay or trans or non-binary or asexual people will be through the consumption of media that contains characters with those identities. And that first impression can and will play a huge role in shaping their perception of that community. And whether creators intend it to be representation or not, the way they depict members of a minority group will always leave an impression on the audience that can colour their attitude toward that group. And creators have a moral obligation to be careful of the kinds of messages they send. The thing about non-binary representation is that while it's becoming more common, it's still very rare, especially in mainstream media. In-depth and thoughtful depictions of the experience are almost unheard of, and when we do appear, we're largely relegated to minor roles with very little exploration of what it means to actually be non-binary. Even using the word is rare enough that people seriously try to argue that doing so ruins the immersion of a story, which allows them to push us to the side and pretend we don't exist. This is one of the reasons I stress the importance of open and straightforward depictions of LGBT identities in fiction, but perhaps an even more important one is that it can literally save people. How many times have you heard a story about someone finding hope and solace in a character that was like them? How many times have you seen someone talk about how seeing a queer character be themselves helped them realize they were queer as well? Because I've heard a lot of stories like that, and I've been the reason behind a few of them myself. I've written several stories with non-binary characters, even ones with a non-binary point of view character, and something that I will forever be proud of, as well as something that will keep me creating, is the people who have told me that my story either gave them the courage they needed to come out as non-binary, or helped them realize that they were non-binary in the first place. Hell, just in covering the different forms of LGBT representation on this channel, I've had numerous people thank me for helping them to feel seen or helping them to understand themselves better. Stories have power, and sometimes you need to hear something being said by someone else to fully internalize it yourself. What sets video games apart from any other form of entertainment media is that they require interaction. It is your choices and your actions as a player that drive the story, that makes it so much more personal and potentially so much more powerful than a book or a movie can be. The role you play in the narrative and the resolution of the characters' stories gives it more power, and it can allow you to relate to them in a way that no other form of storytelling can truly match. Even visual novels and walking sims, which are about as basic of a game as you can make them, still require you to drive them forward, and that personal investment gives their stories more power. There are people who realize they were trans by playing a game as a man or woman when they didn't think they were one. And there are people who realized they were non-binary because they found that being referred to with a gender-neutral pronoun felt good to them. There are people who will create a character that looks as androgynous as possible and feel a connection, and by interrogating that feeling, may find they'd be more comfortable in their own skin if they could look that way. The reason it's important for character builders to give people androgynous options isn't just because it's fun, but because it can aid in self-discovery, or it can make them feel more comfortable with themselves. Even if they're not non-binary, some people still feel more comfortable with certain gender markers stripped away, and they should be allowed to play that way if it makes them happy. And identity integration, alongside being important for proper representation, helps people to feel like they belong in the world of the game. It helps them to feel real and seen, and like they don't merely exist as a strange bug in the code of reality just because they don't identify as male or female. And that can help them feel like they belong in real life too, which is more important now than ever considering how hard the American government is trying to deny the existence of trans people. Non-binary people will continue to exist, and games will continue to depict us, and just as with any other marginalized group, it's important to always expect better and critique what's harmful or wrong. Of the games in this video, I think Veilguard, Teenage Exocolonist, and Saints Row show what non-binary character building options and integration could be in the future. But if we're being honest, you cannot expect every game to live up to these standards. For a number of reasons, you just can't expect everyone to have all of these things, even if that would be fucking incredible. So what can we reasonably expect for the future of non-binary gaming options? Well, I think the next big step for character builders would be mixed pronouns. I mentioned in my character design video that Professor Holmes from Boyfriend Dungeon uses she/they pronouns, and that the game makes sure to alternate between which ones are used, but the player themselves actually doesn't have the option of mixed pronouns, and I think this would be a good thing to start adding to games. Like I said earlier, Exocolonist's pronoun system is fantastic, but not really a feasible option for games with voice acting, but this would be. Not only do games already need to record the VA saying the different pronouns, but it would be comparatively simple to program the game to alternate between them. Not only would this help people who actually use multiple pronouns to finally feel properly represented, but it would give people who aren't sure the chance to try out different pronouns without having to fully commit to something they may not enjoy, and I think that would be helpful. Speaking of, I think more games should give the player the option of changing their gender identity after the character is made. A decent number of games with character builders already have ways in-game to change your appearance, so this would be a logical next step. Finally, for character builders, while I don't think it would be reasonable to expect all games to pull a Saints Row 2022 and have the amazing shape-changing, slider-modified genderless blob person, I do think that more games should give an androgynous option alongside the masculine and feminine ones, and that height and secondary sex characteristics such as body shape and breast and bulge size should be made universally available across all three. This would allow people greater freedom to customize their characters without needing to go full crazy stupid with the sliders. In the case of identity integration, I think that more games should utilize Veilguard's conversation mechanics and allow a character's gender identity to come up in conversation. Making it a toggleable option from the start would also be reasonable, I think, which would allow players to decide their own level of engagement with the system. And last but not least, for fuck's sake, if you're going to give players non-binary options, give them another non-binary character to interact with on a regular basis. Please don't pull another Baldur's Gate 3, just have a non-binary character that feels like they belong in the world alongside you. They don't even have to be particularly nice. You can even add a monstrous one after, as a treat. Just please consider the message you're sending with your representation. I recognise that all of these suggestions will take extra time and effort, but I genuinely believe that the good that can be done with them will be well worth it. Because the medium of gaming is well worth it, as are the people who find their lives changed by it. But it probably still won't be worth $80 fucking. Are you kidding me, Nintendo? Thank you for watching, and a huge thanks to my patrons for their support, and for voting on this video. I want to give an extra big thanks to Owen Oofs, Wistaria, Tetraphobe49 and Lustrous Lizard. This video took an extra long time to make because I had to play the games I wanted to talk about, and also because I spent so much time playing Teenage Exocolonist and Nausea when I should have been working on the script. I actually had to uninstall Exocolonist to get this script done because I played it twice and would have done a third playthrough if I hadn't found my self-control. It was at the bottom of my sock drawer, weirdly enough. I really didn't expect to like it as much as I did. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed and that you'll maybe support me on Patreon, you know, just if you feel like it. That's all for now. I've got a really big video in the works that I'm super excited for, so you should be seeing that later this month. Thanks again and have a lovely day. Bye.